The wind came cruel and sharp across the Wyoming basin, carrying the grit of 1,000 broken miles and the scent of coming snow. It hissed low through the sagebrush, tugging at the hem of Josephine Harrow's torn skirt as she lay sprawled and bleeding in the dust. The sun hung indifferent in a sky too wide to care for dying things, and somewhere in the blue distance, a hawk wheeled lazy circles, waiting. They had left her there just before dawn. Her kin, if that word could still be used, had taken the horses, the water, the coin they'd scraped together through 2 lean years. One bullet grazed her ribs, another scored deep through the meat of her thigh. She couldn't say which hurt worse, the wound or the betrayal. She'd trusted Clay with more than her life. She'd given him her past, every scar and sorrow, every scrap of belief she'd managed to save from the wreckage of Missouri. And when it suited him, he threw her aside like a mule gone lame. Her breath was ragged, uneven. Blood clung to her like second skin, and the cold was setting in fast. Snow would come by nightfall. She could smell it now, the metal-clean edge of it, like a blade drawn from water. The land around her was empty, save for the bones of a burned-out wagon and a scatter of black crows pecking at old sins. She tried to move once. A white-hot jolt lit her from hip to ankle, and she cried out without meaning to. The sound died quick in the wind. Somewhere behind the haze of pain, she knew what was waiting. Not the hawk, not the snow, but the long stillness that came after hope gave out. She'd seen it take children, soldiers, women too tired to keep walking. She'd buried it more than once. But just as her eyes began to close, lured by the soft pull of silence, something disrupted the rhythm of the earth. Hoofbeats, slow and unsteady, like a drunk stumbling through memory. Then a figure, half slouched in the saddle, emerged from the dust. He wasn't Law, she knew that at once. Lawmen rode straight-backed, loud with purpose. This man leaned sideways, arm hanging limp, coat soaked dark at the shoulder. His hat was low over his brow, and a rifle was strapped to the saddle horn like it hadn't seen use in days. His horse limped, ribs showing through patchy hair. He saw her, pulled the horse to a halt, and dismounted with a grunt that sounded more animal than human. Up close, he smelled of blood and gunpowder, like a story that ended badly. His eyes were winter gray, full of the kind of quiet you don't earn without killing something good in yourself. "You alive?" he asked, voice coarse as gravel. She didn't answer. Her pride warred with the pain, but both were losing. She blinked once, slow. He crouched beside her, looked over the wound, then the ground, then her face. "You're not gonna last the night out here." "Then go," she rasped. He shook his head like it was a tired habit. "Can't do that." He moved like his own body betrayed him, favoring his left side, teeth clenched with every step. Still, he lifted her. Not gently, but not cruelly either. She cried out again, couldn't help it, but his arms stayed sure. He didn't ask her name, didn't offer his. Just set her across the saddle like cargo, climbed up behind her, and turned the horse toward the low hills on the horizon. They rode into the wind, 2 broken things stitched together by blood and chance. The crows watched them go, feathers ruffling in the cold. By dusk, the snow had started falling. The snow came down like ash from some far-off fire, soft and steady, blotting out the trail behind them. The outlaw, because there was no other word for him, kept the horse at a careful pace, his jaw tight with pain and eyes scanning the shadows that gathered quick beneath the pines. Josephine drifted in and out of waking. Her leg throbbed with each movement, a deep, pulsing ache that crawled into her spine. She clung to the saddle horn, fingers stiff with cold, teeth clenched against the sounds she didn't want him to hear. A woman left for dead had little pride left, but still she guarded what she could. They crested a rise near dusk and found a half-collapsed trapper's shelter, logs blackened by old fire, roof bowed under years of snow. He didn't hesitate, swung down from the saddle with a grunt, hauled her off next with a care she hadn't expected. No words, just action. Inside, he laid her on a pile of musty hides, then set to work. He moved methodically, gathering wood, coaxing flame from wet tinder, boiling snow for water, one-handed mostly. She watched him through fevered eyes, caught the way he favored his right leg when he walked, the tightness in his mouth when he lifted anything too heavy. Later, when the fire cracked and hissed low, he cut away the cloth from her thigh. She cursed him in a whisper. He didn't flinch. "Bullet still in there," he said. "Can't leave it." She swallowed. "You a doctor now." He glanced at her just once, used to no one, picked up a thing or two. He poured liquor over his knife and over her wound and over his own hands. When the steel touched skin, her scream echoed off the timber walls, sharp and ragged. He didn't stop, didn't speak, just worked, steady as stone, until the slug clinked into the basin and her vision went white with relief. Afterward, he stitched her up with thread pulled from his own coat lining, fingers clumsy but determined, wrapped the leg tight, left her to sleep. The fever came with the snow, and for 2 days she burned, dreamed of Clay's face above her, of hooves pounding into distance, of firelight flickering over hands she didn't recognize. The outlaw sat through it all, barely sleeping, feeding her spoonfuls of snowmelt and shivering beside the flames. Sometimes, when she was still, he would speak under his breath. Names: a town called Grafton, a woman named Helen, words said like prayers or regrets. By the 3rd day, the fever broke. She woke to light slanting through the gaps in the wall and the smell of coffee, weak but clear-headed. He sat with his back to her, mending a tear in his coat with the last of his thread. "You stayed," she said, voice raw. He didn't turn, seemed wrong not to. "I could have died. Figured that might go easier if you weren't alone." Silence hung between them, thick as smoke. She studied his back, the slope of his shoulders, the way his body moved like it remembered hurt too well. He wasn't young, not old either, but worn at the edges, carved out by time and violence. The kind of man who carried ghosts in his coat pockets. "What's your name?" she asked. He paused, needle midair. "Luther." She nodded slowly. "Josephine." He finished the stitch, bit the thread clean, and finally turned. "Well, Josephine," he said, voice quiet, "looks like the worst part's past, but we ain't safe yet." He didn't have to say why. She knew the trail, knew what it was like to be hunted. Outside, the wind had eased, but the world was still white and endless. Somewhere out there, Clay and the others rode with full saddlebags and blood on their hands. She'd survive, she wasn't done yet. And neither, it seemed, was he. The sun returned in slivers, creeping across the snow-packed ridges like a thing uncertain of its welcome. By the time Josephine could put weight on her leg, the wound still hot and aching beneath the bandage, the storm had passed. The sky was clear again, pale blue and vast, and the cold had a sharpness to it that made everything honest. Luther saddled the horse in silence. The beast was gaunt and dull-eyed, but still willing. He didn't speak of where they'd go, only that they couldn't stay. She understood. Fire left smoke. Smoke left questions, and questions had a way of bringing men with rifles. She hobbled to the edge of the shelter, leaning hard on a length of pine he'd carved into a crutch. The world stretched out before them, blanketed in white, trees heavy with frost. No sign of pursuit yet, but she could feel it out there, like a storm held just behind the horizon. They set off slow, Josephine riding while Luther walked beside the horse, one hand steady on the reins, the other pressed tight to his ribs. He moved stiffly, but he never asked for rest. She didn't either. By midday they came upon a creek, its edge glassed with ice, water whispering beneath. He knelt to drink, and she caught a glimpse of the blood on his shirt, fresh and darker than the old stains. The wound in his side was worsening. He hadn't said so, but pain lived in his jaw now, clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "You're hurt worse than you let on," she said. He didn't look up. "Ain't got the time for worse. You need to rest. We keep moving, end of it." She didn't argue, but that night, after they made camp beneath the black arms of a wind-stripped pine, she made him lie down. When he resisted, she met his stare full on. "You carried me out," she said. "Now it's your turn." She peeled back his coat, his shirt, found the bullet grazed too close to his lung, the flesh around it angry and red. She boiled her last scrap of linen in snowmelt, poured whiskey over his side, and cleaned it while he bit down on leather. He didn't cry out, not once, but when she finished, he didn't open his eyes for a long time. She stayed close to him then, feeding the fire in short bursts, her ears tuned to the wind. The woods were too quiet, even the birds had gone elsewhere. That night he spoke in his sleep, words slurred, low, guttural. "Helen," he muttered once, then again, "didn't mean to." Josephine didn't ask. She lay back against the saddle and stared at the stars blinking through the pine limbs. Come morning, they found an old homestead sunk low in a gulch, half buried in snow. No smoke from the chimney, no footprints, just a sagging barn and a porch that leaned like it mourned the people who'd left it. Luther checked the house first. returned with 2 cans of beans, a sack of oats, and a faded quilt. "Whoever lived here," he said, "they're not common back." They stayed 3 days, enough time for him to gain some color, for her leg to stiffen into something usable. She chopped kindling while he fixed the door. He showed her how to snare rabbits, and she taught him how to stretch a stew to last. On the 4th morning, he found her staring out over the gulch, rifle in hand. "Tracks," she said, "coming from the west." He didn't ask who, she didn't say, they both knew. She tightened the laces on her boots. He packed the saddle. No words, no farewells to the house that kept them for a breath of peace. By the time they rode out, the air had the bite of coming change. Trouble was catching up, and neither of them could run forever. They left the homestead behind before the sun had fully crested the pines, shadows stretching long across the snow like old regrets. The air held that stillness just before something breaks, and both of them felt it. Neither said a word. The tracks Josephine had seen were wide and deep, 3 horses, maybe 4, moving at a steady pace. Men who weren't rushing, which meant they thought she was still bleeding out somewhere behind them. It bought time, not much, but enough. They turned east, toward the canyon lands where the snow thinned and the rocks jutted up like broken teeth. It was harsher ground, less cover, but there were caves in those red cliffs, hiding places, if they could reach them. The going was hard. Josephine's legs stiffened with each mile, and Luther's breathing had grown rougher, his voice reduced to a whisper when he spoke at all. She took the lead now, reins in her grip, rifle across her lap. It felt strange to command the trail again, stranger still to have someone at her back. They camped in the lee of a rock wall that night, wind howling through the pass like a thing with lungs and a long memory. Luther didn't eat. He sat hunched near the fire, his hands shaking slightly, eyes fixed on nothing. Josephine sat across from him, fingers curled around a tin cup of weak coffee. "You keep this pace," she said. "You'll drop before we hit the ridge." His mouth twitched, might have been a smile once. "Then I'll drop." She leaned forward. "You're not proving anything by dying." He met her eyes for the first time that night. The firelight caught in his pupils, and something there flickered, grief, maybe, or guilt, or some old sorrow that had never found a place to settle. "I owe someone," he said. She didn't ask who, didn't need to. Instead, she moved to his side, took the cup from his hand, and poured half into hers. "Then live long enough to make good on it." By dawn, the weather turned again. A warm wind came crawling over the canyon floor, stirring the snow into mist. They moved through the haze like ghosts, silent, half-formed. In the distance, they could hear the echo of hooves, voices carried on the wind. Clay's men were close. They reached the edge of the cliffs just after midday. The land fell away sharply, revealing a winding path cut into the rock, narrow, dangerous. Below, the canyons stretched like veins, tangled and sun-baked, a maze to anyone unfamiliar. Josephine dismounted first, testing her leg. Pain shot up her side, but she gritted her teeth. She could walk, she had to. Luther slid off next, slower now, every motion costing him. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. Blood had soaked through the bandage again. They led the horse down the narrow trail, boots slipping on loose shale. The animal shivered with effort, nostrils wide. Josephine kept her rifle ready. She didn't look back. At the canyon floor, Luther finally stumbled. She caught him under the arm. "Don't you dare." His weight sagged against her. "Just give me a minute." She half-dragged him to a crevice in the rock, wide enough to shelter them. Lowered him down gently, heart hammering. He looked up at her, breath shallow. "If they find us." "They won't," she said. "Not yet." Outside, the canyon twisted on into miles of red stone and silence. Josephine reloaded the rifle, settled in beside him, and waited. The wind shifted, and in it she swore she heard hooves. The canyon breathed around them, warm and still and watchful. Josephine sat just within the crevice's shadow, rifle across her knees, the sun casting jagged light across the stone floor. Luther lay against the wall, his breath thin and raspy, skin slick with fever. She watched the path for movement, her pulse matching the quiet tick of time. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but silence could be its own warning. She knew how men hunted. Clay wouldn't rush, not when he believed she had nowhere left to run. "Water," Luther murmured, barely audible. She crouched beside him, lifted his head with one hand and brought the canteen to his lips. He drank in slow sips, eyes barely open, then fell back against the stone. She felt the heat coming off him in waves. The infection was spreading deeper now. "We need to move," she whispered, mostly to herself. He managed a faint shake of his head. "Leave me, you can make it out. I didn't come this far to leave someone behind. You owe me nothing." She sat back on her heels. "Maybe not, but you didn't leave me dying in the dirt either." His gaze drifted, unfocused. "Didn't have it in me, not again." There was more behind those words, whole histories he hadn't shared, but this wasn't the moment for unpacking ghosts. She rested a hand briefly on his arm. "Then we're even." She stayed awake that night, her ears straining in the darkness. Coyotes howled far off. An owl hooted once, then silence returned like a curtain drawn tight. By morning, she made a choice. She wrapped Luther in one of the saddle blankets, tucked the rifle beneath his arm, and whispered, "You stay breathing. I'll be back." Then she climbed. Up the canyon wall, fingers raw against the stone, boots slipping on loose rock. The ascent scraped blood from her palms and sent fire through her thigh, but she didn't stop. She reached the top by mid-morning and crouched low behind a bluff. Below, just where the trail curved, 3 riders waited. Clay sat tall in the saddle, easy as you please, like he had all the time in the world. Beside him, 2 others, Wade and Finch, cruel-eyed and twitchy. Their horses picked at the gravel, tails flicking at flies. Josephine didn't hesitate. She raised the rifle, steadied her breath, and fired. The first shot took Finch in the shoulder. The second cracked past Wade's head. She saw Clay dive from his horse, shouting orders. Then she ran back down the trail, into the canyon, heart pounding like hooves in her ears. She reached the bottom, in half the time it had taken to climb. Luther was still breathing, barely. She grabbed the saddlebags, pulled out cartridges, food, anything light and worth keeping. Slung her rifle over one shoulder and half-lifted, half-dragged Luther up. He groaned but didn't wake. There was a narrow side passage to the east, one Luther had pointed out the night before. "Smugglers used it," he'd said. "Steep, but it cuts through." She took it. Through rock and thorn, through choking dust and old animal bones. She kept one hand on the stone to steady herself, the other curled around the blanket supporting Luther's weight. Behind them, gunfire echoed, close. She didn't stop. By dusk, they reached the far side. The air was cooler here, the wind stronger. In the distance, a river glinted, thin but real, life. She collapsed beside him beneath an outcropping, lungs heaving. He stirred, eyes fluttering open. "You came back." "You sound surprised," she said. "I am. Guess you'll have to get used to it." Night fell slow and full of stars. Neither of them spoke again. But something had shifted between them, quiet as the earth turning beneath their backs. The river was narrow and cold, cutting through the canyon floor like a silver thread. They followed it slowly, Luther leaning against her shoulder when he walked, resting long stretches between each push forward. Josephine bore his weight with a quiet steadiness, the pain in her leg dulled to a throb she no longer flinched from. Survival had a way of narrowing the world to motion, breath, and grit. For 3 days they moved east, tracing the bends of the water, deeper into country neither of them knew. The sun warmed the days but dropped bitter at night, and each morning Luther woke coughing, blood bright in the phlegm he tried to hide. He was dying. She saw it in the way he moved slower with each hour, in the slack of his fingers when he reached for the rifle and found it too heavy. Still, he kept going. For her, or maybe for whatever name he whispered in the dark when he thought she was asleep. On the 4th day, they reached a low stretch of land where a handful of cottonwoods leaned toward the river like old men in council. Beyond the trees stood a cabin, small but solid, smoke curling from its chimney. Josephine stared at it for a long while before saying, "Could be folks." Luther nodded, "Could be trouble." She helped him sit beneath the largest cottonwood, rifle across his lap. "I'll go see." He caught her wrist as she turned. "If I go quiet while you're gone." "You won't." But his fingers didn't let go. She looked down at him, at the pale slack of his face, the frost clinging to the edges of his beard. "Hold on, Luther, we're close." He nodded once and let her go. She approached the cabin slow, one hand raised, the other near her pistol. A woman met her at the porch older, lined with years and sun, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. Behind her, a boy of no more than 10 peered from the doorway. Josephine spoke low. Got a man hurt, needs warmth, maybe a place to rest a spell. The woman studied her a moment, then nodded. Bring him. Together they carried Luther inside. The warmth hit like a wave. He sagged into it, eyes half closed, whispering thanks to no one in particular. The woman, Mrs. Mallory, she said, took one look at him and went straight to work, boiling water, crushing herbs, muttering about infection and stubborn men. Josephine stood to the side, letting it happen, her body swaying with exhaustion. That night she sat beside his bed. The boy snored soft in the next room. The cabin creaked like a ship in still water. Luther stirred once, fingers brushing hers. I thought I'd die out there, he murmured. You almost did. He smiled faintly. Why'd you come back? She didn't answer right away. She looked at the fire, then at him. Because you didn't leave me. His eyes closed again, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. In the days that followed, he mended. Not fast, not whole, but enough. The color returned to his cheeks, the sharp edge left his cough. Josephine helped Mallory with chores, fed the animals, fetched wood. She slept beside the fire near Luther, always near. They stayed through the thaw, watched the snow melt from the river's edge, the land stretch open into a wide green hush. And when he could walk without staggering, they sat one morning on the porch, watching the sun rise over the cottonwoods. What now? He asked. Josephine looked east, toward land she hadn't seen since before the war, and west, toward all they'd fled. We build something, she said. Doesn't have to be much. Luther nodded, hands folded in his lap. He didn't ask where, or when, or with what, just sat beside her, quiet and certain. Because home, she'd learned, wasn't a place. It was a decision made daily, a promise kept, a hand reached for in the dark. And love, it wasn't rescue. It was staying. Even when the trail left you broken. Even when the snow came down hard.